Good evening. I'm Len Downey. I'm a professor here at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism. I think this is my 9th year. Before that, I worked at the Washington Post for 44 years. With the last 17 of those years, I was the executive editor of the paper. For the 7 years before that, I was managing editor under Ben Bradley before I succeeded him as executive editor. And early on in the 1960s, I was a young investigative reporter in Washington and retained my interest, to say the least, in investigative reporting throughout my career, whatever job I held at the Post. Making sure that we did as much investigative reporting as possible was one of my interests. So it is really a great pleasure for me tonight to introduce you to Carol Leonnig, who now is a 3-time Pulitzer Prize winning investigative reporter for the Washington Post. She joined the staff of the Post in 2000 and started out investigating city government corruption and covering the federal courts, and is now an investigative reporter on the Post national staff. She won the Pulitzer Prize for national reporting all by herself in she won a Pulitzer Prize for national reporting with a team of reporters in 2015. No, I'm sorry, I got to go back again. She won the Pulitzer Prize all by herself in 2015 for her investigation of security problems in the U.S. Secret Service and its presidential detail, which we'll talk more about later. She shared the 2014 Pulitzer Prize for public service for the Washington Post revelations of the National Security Agency's surveillance of American citizens, the so-called Snowden information. And she shared this year's Pulitzer Prize for national reporting for the Washington Post investigation of contacts between Russia and associates and advisors of Donald Trump. Currently, Carol is continuing to investigate the Trump White House and the special counsel's investigation of the president. I guess a good place to begin, Carol, would be for you to tell us what you were doing on that team that just won the Pulitzer Prize.
So, that is so loud. What I was doing was essentially working with a team of reporters who are already thigh deep in a campaign and a new administration, trying to understand why it appeared that the Russian meddling in the election was such a toxic topic to the president. Russians, as you know, the state had ordered sort of a hack of a series of embarrassing emails about Hillary Clinton, and then using WikiLeaks, dispense them at key moments during the campaign. More details about that are still to be learned, but when I joined the team, they'd already broken open some amazing stories, including the firing of Michael Flynn, who had lied about his contacts with the Russian ambassador. They'd covered the firing of Jim Comey, who was the FBI director and refused sort of a loyalty pledge when the president sought it, and refused to say in congressional testimony that he could not verify that there was no collusion by the Russians in the election and in the campaign. So I joined them when they were already off to the races on this topic, but my assignment was essentially understanding what was the legal vulnerability of the president's campaign, his political campaign, and ultimately many of the advisors who joined him in the White House.
There's a misunderstanding, I think, in the general public about how investigative reporting works, which is encouraged by some of the targets of investigative reporting, and that somehow you are simply the recipient of some dark stranger who shows up on your doorstep with a suitcase full of documents and tells you everything you wanted to know about X. Or it's various people who will call you up and want to leak information about the administration. But you are one of the great source makers that I know. Can you describe how it really works and how you find, develop, and manage sources?
I have this both a blessing and a curse of the low register voice that makes people believe that I'm somebody to be trusted, and I'm joking a little bit about that, but because I do take it seriously when a source trusts me with sensitive information, and I make clear to them what I think are the risks of them providing me that information, and also the incredible incentives to help the public and the democracy by sharing this information with me and ultimately with the Washington Post and the public. To answer your question, it is true, no dark, tall stranger has showed up and handed me a story. It never happens like that. You will get in my business a tip or two. Often they are vague, they are unspecific, and sometimes they are rumors that are half true and half very, very true. Half false and half very true, and you have to ferret out which part is which. Sometimes, and this has happened a lot in this past year, we and my colleagues will get a tip, and we have to beat every bush you can imagine, trying to figure out who else might have this information, who might be approachable, and who might have an incentive to share it with us. It's a lot of work, and it's always fun when you finally land it and you get it and you meet the standard, the very high standard at the Washington Post to publish information, which is that if you have anonymous sources, they must be people with a reason to know, some first-hand knowledge, some front row seat to this information. It's always a riot when you finally meet that incredibly high standard, and then it is called fake news when you publish it. We break our backs to get it, and it rests upon ultimately, I think increasingly now, very well motivated and frightened people.
I like to use the term confidential sources rather than anonymous sources, because anonymous makes it sound like you don't know who they are either, but you have a confidentiality agreement with them. How do you first approach a news source like this as somebody who's new, and help them understand, help to convince them that they should answer your inquiries, help you with the story, even if it goes against, even if it could cause them problems with their job or have some other reason why they'd be frightened to talk to you? And then what kind of agreements do you reach with them?
So this will bore some of you who I was in sessions with earlier today, but Len's question is such a smart one. And when I approach a source, and when I realize that they might have some information that might be useful for the public to understand a subject better, I think of two things. What is the number one fear that they have about what risks they take speaking to me, and what is tops in their list in terms of incentives and motivations to share this information with me. And people accuse reporters of being con men, and I guess in a way we are, because we really certainly emphasize the good purpose of sharing information with us. But I really try to bend over backwards, now having had sources pay a pretty dramatic price for sharing information with me, the loss of their jobs, for example. After these experiences, which are heartbreaking, I really try my hardest to bend over backwards to explain to sources that and address straight up front what I think are the risks for them sharing information with me. And we talk through, I think, in a very genuine way, how large a group of people know this. Are you the only other person? Are you one of only 3 that knows this piece of information? If that's the case, this might be too risky for you to share with me now, or we may have to find a document or an email or a journal that helps concretize this. If you are really one of a very, very small handful of people that know this. I think, I might have frightened away a few sources in this way, frightened in the sense of they weren't able to provide the information that would have been valuable. But I like to think that it's better in the long term, and that it is not just a transactional, give me what I need so I can get out of here and nail a scoop. I try to do what an editor at the Philadelphia Inquirer said to me when I was in my 20s, treat all these people like you're going to be needing them for 20 years. And I do it better now than I used to.
Speaking of 20 years, are there sources that you've developed over the years as a reporter that you can go back to again and again because they may rise up the chain of command in something, whatever it is that they're doing? And so by taking the trouble to treat them well as sources and to take them seriously and show an interest in what they're doing, when you first meet them, that's valuable later on. I try to talk to students about that idea that anybody that you're interviewing at any time is a potential future source.
Absolutely. And it's funny, this is true for sources, and it's also true for newspaper critics, like the most hardened readers who think that the newspaper is in the tank for one side or the other. When you take the time to understand a subject well and invest with that source a lot of energy to get each little fact right, including the spelling of their name, if you're using their name, including the number of people that were in the room, including the nuance of a piece of law that they are the expert in. When you invest that energy, they think to themselves, wow, I can trust this person with something maybe a little more sensitive, and then maybe something even more sensitive. And I think Len knows this because while he was quite frightening to me then because I was a junior nobody, he was the editor at the paper that ultimately hired me. Now I'm not as scared of him, but he does know this. When I took a job covering federal courts, it was a bit of a backwater beat at the time. It was managed by the Metro section, and I landed in it as I returned from a maternity leave. It was the one job that was open. But the sources I met there have been with me ever since. And it's funny, I didn't know this at the time, but Len had been the federal courts reporter years earlier. I don't know how many years earlier. And
mid-60s.
And those assistant U.S. attorneys who were in their 20s when I was in my 20s, those judges who treated me as the daughter that didn't go to law school and tried to help me understand things, the defense bar that was there, all of those people have risen quite dramatically and have been in very important positions. I couldn't have known that then, but it has been valuable to me many times over to have spent the time making sure that I got the stories about their little nothing cases right way back then.
And Bob Woodward always talks about trying to find documents to back up what the sources are telling you. A lot of the reporting you're doing now, there's not much documentation, but to what extent have you been able to seek out and use documents, and how do you go about doing that?
It has been really, unfortunately, a very low document season covering this case. I try my darndest to find ways that we can have contemporaneous records that buttress what we're reporting. So, for example, recently a source came to me and said, I won't go into all the details, it would be too revelatory, I suppose. But the source alleged a particular set of facts that were very controversial and interesting, and there was no trail of documents to back this up. But the person did keep a contemporaneous kind of a diary, a schedule, if you will, of their daily events. And it was detailed enough that it corroborated their version of events and was important in supporting their work. I would say that one of the most disappointing parts of this season is that there are not enough documents. And I've done some really fun investigations with Sarah Cohen, if you all know that professor here and have had some interactions with her. And those stories are kind of bulletproof because nobody can come at you when all the documents show that these are the results. People can fight over the interpretations, but documents are a wonderful tool.
You mentioned fake news earlier and just alluded again to the criticisms that this administration levels against the press when it sees stories it doesn't like. How much of that have you felt? Have you been personally attacked?
I've not been attacked by name, but my stories certainly have been. And I think when I came back into the newsroom in July, I had been on leave writing a book, taking longer at it than I should have. And I returned right in the muck of things, and I was sort of shocked to have our stories assailed. Everyone else around me on the team was like, huh, this is nothing. But I feel that our responsibility is to just make it plain, more and more plain and more clear how we do our stories, document in writing, tell people this is how we learned it. These are the people that provided the information. If we can't name them because they're in too much risk of being named, let's describe how they know the information. And let's show how painstaking it is to do these kinds of stories. So even though the president or his team may attack the pieces as fake news, readers can see what we've done.
In fact, I've even seen a number of the stories you've worked on and others, the number of sources that you've contacted for a story, which seems like a new development to me. I saw one that said 12 sources of these various different kinds. Some in the White House, some the people that the White House talked to, some in Congress.
And that number, it really irritates the president because he views and has said, I shouldn't say how he views it, but he has said that he views it as an indictment of all these people that are leaking things about his administration. I don't like the word leak. A leak is when, and I think that this administration and a couple before it overuse and abuse the word. A leak is when someone provides a classified piece of information or a top secret piece of information that they are not supposed to, and that must be referred to the U.S. Attorney's Office for a review about the potential danger it poses to the nation's security. Communicating how much television the president watches, or describing discussions about firing the Attorney General, those are not leaks. That is called communication with a reporter and reporting.
You mentioned leaks investigations. The Attorney General has said the Obama administration conducted an unusual number of leaks investigations and actually prosecuted government sources of information in, I think, 8 instances under the Espionage Act. We've already seen 2 such prosecutions already by this administration. And the Attorney General says, I think he said they had 3 times as many investigations going on as during the previous administration. Is that having an impact on your sources? Does that have an impact on how you approach your reporting? Is there some concern that your sources can be subjects of criminal investigations? And do you even think that they may want at some point to make the point by going after reporters?
It does scare me that it is inevitable that when we publish some information that is classified, that there will be a hardcore effort to ferret out the sources. I think, fortunately or unfortunately, I don't know which way to tilt on this, the president seems more focused on that former group, information that is not the subject and can never be the subject of a criminal referral. But we take, as I described earlier, we take a lot of time walking through with sources the universe of humans that could have this same information. As I said, I mean, my heart really hurt at the punishment that sources who came forward with important information bore as a result of sharing information with me and with the readers. In this case, mostly about the Secret Service's dysfunction and the danger that, and I found it so ironic that the Obama administration, which claimed that it was the most transparent in history, as you documented so well, was going the hardest after leakers and punished the people that were trying to illustrate and demonstrate and out how much danger President Obama was in because the Secret Service was not performing its job.
I want to come back to the Obama administration's performance on leaks and its relationship with the press, because I think that context is missing at the moment when so much controversy surrounds this current administration's relationship with the press. But I'd like to talk about the Secret Service investigation. How did that begin? And how did you first get on that story? How did you go about what triggered in you the idea of investigation? Investigation reporting comes in 2 different kinds. There's the project where you decide that you or your editors decide that there's something you ought to be investigating. It's going to produce a 7-part series or a series on television or something like that. And then there's the kind of investigative reporting that grows out of beat reporting, where a beat reporter who covers some particular subject comes across something that then becomes an investigation, one story at a time, rather than some big planned out project. And Secret Service is the latter.
Absolutely the latter. So it began with a fairly salacious story that I wasn't intending to cover. But in 2012, a group of Secret Service agents were in Colombia in South America, and they were sent home rather unceremoniously on private planes from this presidential trip because they had brought prostitutes back to their room in the hours and maybe 24 hours before the president was slated to arrive. It was a hot story, and a colleague of mine at the Washington Post, David Nakamura, broke it, and then I was pulled in to help because, you know, I get people on the phone and I try to get them to talk to me. And I was brought into the story to help David sort of suss out what had happened in Colombia. What in the world were these guys thinking? And had anything like this ever happened before? So in the course of doing that reporting, you know, we took a lot of care to make sure we got it right. We understood actually that things like this had happened before. Things like this had happened before with senior management. We learned from listening to even the agents who were implicated that they were being punished in a very dramatic way just because the event had become public, and that things like this had never been punished before and were not de rigueur, but not that unusual. You know, it was kind of like this whole wheels up quality. These were the spoils of having to work this hard and travel all over the country and miss your family. You're supposed to be able to party like rock stars when you left the country with the president. In the course of doing all that reporting, I met a lot of agents, and I met a lot of their friends, and I
Can I
met.
stop you for a second? So you hadn't covered the Secret Service before, so you didn't know any of these people. So how did you decide what agents to talk to, and then how did you go about first talking to them?
I know this sounds funny, but I'd rather not say.
Okay.
If I told you exactly how it happened, then it would.
No, I don't mean exactly. I just mean in terms of techniques generally. I mean, you go through a phone book of Secret Service agents, or you contact one person and that leads to another person to another person?
So we did Len knows these people really well, but you know, the news researchers, Alice Kreitz and Julie Tate, basically make all reporters look brilliant. They hunt for leads and humans and their cell phone numbers and their parents' numbers and their home addresses, and they hand us these stacks of paper, which are essentially like, you know, real estate leads. We immediately start cold calling and visiting, and that's really how that all began.
That's the point.
Yeah, and they make us look brilliant. But really how this began was kind of like a L'Oreal shampoo commercial, because I met a particular person, and once I had convinced that particular person that I was dedicated to getting this story right and not just sexing up the Cartagena story of how all these guys had prostitutes in their room, but I really wanted to understand the deeper story and explain how management was treating it and how management had treated it in the past. Once I convinced that guy, I got his two friends and then his two friends. And again, it was like establishing a kind of trust. You have to be genuine, you have to be real, you have to deliver on your promise as a reporter. And I reaped the benefit of delivering what I promised I would do.
And then crazy things happened. People jumped the fence. One guy got inside the White House, and so on. Well, what happened there?
So I apologize. I made that Cartagena story so long, and Len's like, come on, let's get to how you got to the Pulitzer Prize. So what happened was, because I met all these people, they flagged to me, there is something much bigger than hookers in Cartagena. There is something much more serious, which is the decay of our agency, the lack of funding, terrible management, leadership that is corrupt, and that the president's not safe. And we have a series of incidents we'd like to share with you about the ways in which the president has been made vulnerable. And, you know, at first you're like listening to this going, oh yeah, sure, the Cartagena thing doesn't mean anything. You guys have this other story. But they were able to show me that the examples that were really quite powerful. Think about how crazy this is. An event in April 2012 leads me to a series of stories in 2014. That's how long it took me to sort of pull all this string and gather it up. You know, in the midst of this, we had Ferguson, we had, you know, Bob Menendez indicted. There were all sorts of stories happening the whole time, but I just kind of kept this notebook of what all these guys, mostly guys, were describing, and all of their anecdotes and their documents and their materials that supported it. And finally, you know, at the Washington Post, we have this thing called the memo. And the memo is when you're finally ready to lay out a series of stories that you think you can tell that are part of a big project, part of a big theme, and that, you know, if your memo's really good, you can maybe get some time away from the Menendez case and the Ferguson duty, and you have a good enough series of stories that we're going to let you do it. And finally I got the guts up to show Marty, and he's like, oh yeah, you got to do that. So the first story that was on my list, which Marty Barron, the executive editor, really wanted done, was the story about a shooting at the White House that had been covered up and not really properly reported. And while I was reporting that story and getting happily a ton of documents, including FBI documents that really told the full story of this shooting and how it had been bungled by the Secret Service and then covered up. While I was working on that and almost done with the story, a guy jumped the fence at the White House. And sort of like overnight, my memo became like, I'm sorry, my mom would be so mad that I just said like, my memo became quite urgent, and my series of stories became instantly far more relevant than even my Washington Post editors had envisioned, or that I had envisioned. So we wrote the jumper story. All the sources that I had all since 2012, were ringing my phone nonstop that night to tell me what they knew about the jumper, all the ways in which this had been bungled as well, all the ways in which the Secret Service was trying to paper over what had happened and cover it up in real time. And wrote 3 stories all weekend long, ruined my entire anniversary with my husband. And then Monday morning, Marty said, okay, so can you finish up that story about the shooting? Because now we really need you to finish that story on the shooting. Wrote the story on the shooting and then wrote the next story on my memo, and that's the answer.
For the young reporters out here, she said, recounting of this, 2 very important things. One was sources leading to other sources. A couple guys, and then they recommend a couple more guys, recommend a couple more guys. Developing that kind of source relationship. It's not the first person you found in the phone book and you stay with them. You're constantly asking. In fact, they often should be the last question in an interview is, who else knows about this? Who else can I talk to about this? And can I come back and talk to you again? Because Carol repeatedly talks to sources over and over again. I've had the opportunity a couple of times while waiting to talk to her in the newsroom in years past of hearing her on the telephone with a source. And this is a relationship that she's developed, not a relationship in which she's going to do any favors with them, but for them, they know that, but a relationship in which when she's made them partners in getting at the truth. I'm trying to remember the other thing you said, which was important. It'll come back to me.
Yeah. It's funny. I remember, this is just a passing thing, but Len, I remember the day that I wrote the jumper story, and it was before I finished.
Oh, that was what I was just saying.
Go ahead.
I just remember the other thing. She has sources calling her. Something has happened, and she doesn't even have to call them right away. They're calling her. It's that kind of relationship that she's established with people who really care about the future of their agency. They care about the protection of the President of the United States, and they know this is an important thing for them to do, is to call Carol and give her information. And that's the kind of relationship you eventually want to develop with sources.
I remember, now that we're talking about it, that for some bizarre reason you were in the newsroom. I don't know if you were just visiting or if you had business to attend.
I was visiting.
And
after my retirement.
And it was the day after a long weekend of writing all the jumper stories. And you came over to me and you crouched down near my desk and you said, "Keep going." That was great.
So how did you get into this in the first place? When did you decide you wanted to be a journalist? How did you go about doing that? And how so early in your career did you gravitate towards investigative reporting?
So I think a couple lucky breaks and a couple just accidents. I went to school outside Philadelphia, and an editor at the Philadelphia Inquirer senior year, I worked on the college newspaper. I won't go in and bore everybody with that, but I got kind of the bug about reporting in college as a result of a very compelling and controlling editor of the paper who I admired, and she sucked me into it, and I kept working there, and it was a lot of fun. And then I eventually became the editor of this little college newspaper. A fairly prominent editor at the Philadelphia Inquirer had graduated from another school that was like the brother school to my school. It was Haverford and Bryn Mawr. And he made a tour my senior year to look for journalists in the offing that he might be able to succor into working at the Philadelphia Inquirer for $220 a week in a correspondence program. And we came, and we're like interns, glorified interns essentially, who came to work at the illustrious Philadelphia Inquirer. And it was a wonderful paper, which was a Pulitzer factory at the time. And I was surrounded by people who were some of the best in the business, and you kind of, that was a contagious kind of feeling. I sat next to a guy named George Anastasia. I haven't thought about him in a long time, but he covered the mob. He was the best guy in the world to cover the mob, totally relaxed, goes to their weddings and their funerals and works the phone like a magic master. And I remember thinking, this is what I want to do. This is it. Lucked out, went to the Charlotte Observer after that, part of the Knight Ridder chain that also had owned the Philadelphia Inquirer, and then lucked out when Len decided to raid the Knight Ridder chain and hire a bunch of us to work for the Washington Post, which was my, the paper that I grew up on, living in Maryland. And I think that's it.
Well, yeah, and you started by covering a beat at the Post, which is the normal way to get started. And somehow on that beat, you gravitated into investigative stories. How did that happen? You could have covered a beat perfectly well without doing that, I assume, but...
I do think that I was excited about the revelatory quality of investigative reporting. It was very professionally satisfying to have a story hit like a thud. And I mean that the way I'm saying it. I hope it's getting across. But like for a story to have power, for it not just to be fleeting, for it to reveal something people didn't want revealed, and for it to have a life after that day's fish wrap, to have impact. And I think the Lead and Water series that I sort of happened into, again, working with David Nakamura and Joe Becker.
Can you explain that a little bit more?
So
Happened into it?
I was covering city agencies, and you guys might not know this, but when I arrived in DC, we had a legacy of broken city government. Broken in part because of Marion Barry and years and years of poor stewardship of the city. And so my job was sort of to like see, would the city fix itself? Would it resolve all its long-standing dysfunction, and would it govern properly? Could it fix potholes? Could it educate kids? Could it do the basic things it was supposed to do? And in the course of this, a colleague of mine, again, interestingly, check this out, David Nakamura, before the Secret Service story, he broke this story, which was in the fine print of a little report, that the city's water had elevated levels of lead for more than a year and a half, likely 2.5 years. And this tiny fine print, which was the legally required language, was so buried that nobody in the city knew. So he broke this story, and again, city editor, everybody threw all these resources at us, figuring out what had gone wrong. How could this have happened? Why didn't the Department of Health know about it? Didn't the city utility, weren't they properly regulated? And that story had so much power because we answered some devastating questions with horrible answers. Multiple agencies, local and federal, had known about this and had not done anything about it. In fact, some had covered it up. It had had significant health impacts, which we didn't know right away, and that had also, we'd also been lied to, and the public had been lied to about it. It involved a lot of documents. It involved a lot of source development. I've lost track of the question. Am I answering it?
Yes, you are. Yes.
It was really satisfying work. Some of the best, even just our little scrappy City Hall team, we were able to basically say that the EPA, the Department of Health, the mayor's office, and a very large, profitable utility had put pregnant women and children and older people in real danger.
You talked about the satisfaction of those kinds of stories having impact. Where's the line for you between impact and a desired outcome, which obviously is definitely facing you now in the reporting you're doing about the Trump administration, where you want to reveal things that you believe the public should know on the one hand, and on the other hand, is there a temptation to think of some desired outcome? You know, you want to see change occur.
I do not have any desired outcome except that we share the truth with readers. Actually, it's a little bit awkward. I don't know if this is what your question is getting at, Len, so forgive me, but one really awkward thing that happens in Washington a lot now is that people will come up to you if you're a reporter at the Washington Post, particularly if they're a liberal Democrat, and they will say, "Thank you so much for what you're doing. You're going to bring this president down." And I frown and say thank you, except that's not my goal. My goal is to share this information with you and publish what's true, and democracy will decide the rest. You know, our House of Representatives and our Senate may decide, our criminal justice system may decide. Please thank me for the amount of time I'm not spending with my children and my husband getting information for you, but I really don't have a goal.
This is such an important distinction about investigative reporting. I was one of the editors on the Watergate story many years ago, as Carol knows, and we never were trying to force Richard Nixon to resign or be impeached. I was also the editor of the Washington Post during the investigations of Bill Clinton, and we never were seeking to have him impeached or removed as president. We were seeking to inform the public about what they needed to know and leave it to the public and the various parts of the government to do their job based on our information. You frequently have worked in teams. It used to be investigative reporters were lone wolves. I remember back in the mid-1960s when I was an investigative reporter for several years, I did all my work myself. I couldn't imagine working with somebody else. It was exciting to be this lone wolf detective out there. So what's it like to work on these teams, some of which become quite large now?
Well, you know, I was talking to my friend Roz Helderman. If you see her name in a byline, definitely read the story. She's like a walking dictionary about Russia and the investigation. But I was talking to her about this very point. You know, what do you think is the reason we now have 4 bylines on a story? Used to have to get permission to have 3 bylines on a story. Now we have 4 and 7 people on the credit line, which is the tagline at the bottom of the story, showing just how many people have been invested in this. And I said, what do you think is the deal? Do you think we've gotten more collaborative? And she said, no, the stuff is coming at us so fast. No one person can do it. And it is breakneck pace, to the point that I actually am a little bit worried. I am an investigative reporter by instinct, by gut, that's what I really love. And I'm not sure that we're landing with a thud anymore the same way. It's like, that was the morning story. Here's the afternoon story. We got another one for you. I'm a little anxious about it. The teamwork is amazing. Everybody pulls together. There have been a couple, big egos. But overall, I'm so proud of how seamlessly and how hard everyone works for the joint purpose, which is fact.
Collaboration is a very, very important aspect of modern journalism. For those of you getting into journalism, being able to sacrifice your ego to be part of a team that's going to do better work than you could possibly do by yourself, obviously with some exceptions. Pretty soon we want to be able to make time for questions from the audience. Let me just ask you about the NSA, National Security Agency surveillance stories based on the digital documents provided by Edward Snowden. How did that work? That's unusual. You were handed something in that case. The Washington Post, in the person of Bart Gellman, was handed all this trove of information, and then what?
That was an amazing event because Bart Gellman, who's had been a role model of mine and a colleague all at the same time, had left the Washington Post and all of a sudden mysteriously showed up in our pages one morning, and very few of us knew the story that he had, and it was the first crack at revealing some of what Edward Snowden had shared with him about warrantless, broad surveillance of Americans who for whom there was no probable cause that they'd been involved in anything terrorist or illegal. And after that first story, editors decided that there were a couple reporters at the Post who could help Bart get these stories into the paper more quickly, and also help because of their expertise in particular areas. My expertise at that time, again, luckily from my boring little sleepy beat at the federal courthouse, was that I knew how the FISA court worked, which was a secret surveillance court, a group of judges that rotate in deciding whether or not to sign off on secret warrants to spy on both foreign and U.S. persons. I knew how that court worked, and I knew the chief judge is going back, because there had been several of them. And I had some sources who had some familiarity with that court and knew how it worked. I won't bore you with it except to say that the president, Obama at the time, insisted that the FISA court had been a great backstop against all of this warrantless surveillance, and that they had been properly making sure that the warrantless surveillance was done carefully and judiciously. And the FISA judge, when I went to talk to him about it, he'd not been interviewed by anyone and never had given an interview before. When I went to talk to him about it and told him what the president had said and what our documents showed from Mr. Snowden, and shared that with him, he said, no, we knew nothing about this, and we were not a backstop. We couldn't be a backstop for something we didn't know anything about. And that was a fairly big deal, and put a big hole in the idea that this program was so carefully vetted.
So again, that's a story that did not come out of what was given to the Washington Post. It's something you got. And again, as an example of sources that she developed long ago, once again being useful down the road, which is very, very important about source development. In a couple minutes, we're going to take your questions, so you may want to start coming up to the microphone here. This is being recorded. It'll be archived by the school. It'll be useful in classes. I know I'll be using it in my classes in the future. So if you want to start up to the microphone, while I ask Carol one last question of my own, which is, with all this kind of work that you do that's so sensitive, and I know that Bart Gellman, for instance, verges on being a nut about security and trying to prevent himself from being hacked and his records being hacked and so on. What concerns do you have about that, about the confidentiality of your work with sources and so on? Do you take precautions with your emails? Do you take precautions with your phone calls?
I have been asked this question many times, and even though I like Len more than most of the people that have asked me this question, I will give the same answer, which is yes, I take precautions.
Fine. That's just what I wanted to know, because that's, again, something I think a lot of students don't realize is now becoming pretty de rigueur amongst reporters, particularly involved in national security, politics, and investigative reporting.
Meeting in garages is a good idea.
Right. Yes, you have a question.
Hi, thank you so much for coming and speaking today. My question is...
Please identify yourself each as you ask a question.
Sorry, my name's Camden Cook. I'm a freshman here at Cronkite. And my question is, what would be your primary piece of advice for aspiring investigative reporters?
Throw yourself into every opportunity that's brought to you. It's easy to work really, 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 really hard at your age. So offer for weekends, offer to work on every team that needs a helping hand. Even if the work might seem low pay / low status, you'll learn a lot from the people that you're around. I feel like I learned so much again from those guys in the room in the Philadelphia Inquirer, just sitting next to people that were the pros in their work. And you'll be amazed what you will gain from it.
I always tell students that it really doesn't matter where you work in terms of the reputation of the news organization, so much as finding a place where there's at least one editor or one reporter who's really good. Probably has been there a long time, really knows that area, and has a lot of tricks of the trade. And then get yourself mentored by that person and do good stories under that mentorship, because you learn more from that usually than, well, in addition to journalism school, but more than you would formally learn from relationships with editors. Is that other journalist in that newsroom who's really good, who can really teach you things you want to know. Thank you for that question. You mentioned something about home life. I meant to ask you that too. I also warn students. I think obviously being a journalist is a great calling. And it's great to aspire to it. But I also warn them it's not good for your social life. You're not gonna be popular. You're not gonna be going out dancing a lot. And when you get married, you're not gonna be home a lot when you're doing your work. It's just something you have to manage, and you have to be ready for that. How do you manage that?
I have a great mom who lives nearby, and I have a great husband. I have two pretty responsible daughters. So, and for many years, I had this person that lived in our house, an au pair actually, who was just amazing. And again, she saved my bacon 1,000,000 times. But I do find myself trying to carve out special time, like when I can have this time with my family, like throwing my phone over here as much as I can. It's not easy to do, but I think if you're going to have an hour with them, have it without all of the interruption. And, you know, if the president fires sessions in that hour, I guess I'll just have to give that one up. The concept of compartmentalization got a bad rap, I think, probably during the Clinton administration, when he clearly compartmentalized different parts of his life. But that's really helpful to journalists, is to be able to compartmentalize, to be able to be focused on what you're doing when you're doing it journalistically. And then, as you say, if you've set a time to turn it off, then go into that compartment for a while. You'll come back to the other one later. But it's difficult to do. Yes, sir.
Yes, hi. My name is Raul Bengomo. Thank you for coming and speaking to us. Transfer student here at Cronkite. The art investigator reporting, the art of anything usually encompasses a type of uniqueness or imagination. So I guess my questions for both, if willing. Do you believe journalism is a necessity or an asset? Journalism school, and in particular, if you do think journalism school is as important, what in particular makes a great journalist school? Thank you.
My answer will be quick. I did not go to journalism school. I didn't think it was necessary, but I look at this school and I look at some of the others that I've visited, and I can see what an asset it is. It's stunning what a professional level of the trade is being practiced here and learned here. So that's my answer.
Until my later years at the Post, when the digital revolution came along, until then, the skills of journalists were so narrow that it didn't matter to me as a hiring person whether you went to journalism school or not, but what you showed me in terms of your clips and other things about what kind of journalist you were. So you could be a good journalist as a biology major at Haverford, and because you've shown me that in your summer internships and so on, as well as a graduate of the Columbia School of Journalism. But that's changed now. And now the skill level that's required, so many different skills, all the digital skills that are required, I think makes it all the more important to actually go to journalism school. You should have another major. You should become an expert on China or the law or something else at the same time, because that makes you more saleable and a better journalist at the outset when you first get your first job. But you really need to learn all the skills that you learn here at the Cronkite School, which is why there's no longer a broadcast track here or a digital track or a print track or something else. You have to learn all the skills, because the people that are being hired now by most news organizations are multi-skilled journalists. And in fact, when you're being hired, you don't know if you're going to be, when you're looking for a job, if you're initially going to be somebody who covers the police department, or you're going to be somebody on the night shift of the website, having to put things up on the website, or whether you're going to be primarily a videographer for a while. So I think that makes journalism school more important now than it used to be. And I'm a journalism school graduate in the early 60s, so that's why I said that.
Thank you both.
Yeah. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Stacy Galandi with the Women's Eye podcast, and I was a freshman 30 years ago. So I wanted to find out, is it unprecedented, this administration, in terms of the investigative reporting that has come out of it? And do you think that it's sort of raised the bar for investigative journalism? Where do you think it's going? Do you have a prediction? And of course, what did you really think of the movie The Post?
3 questions in one, not bad.
I know.
Okay, let me see if I can
Loaded
take that.
for questions.
I don't think that the volume of investigative reporting is dramatically different now than it was under the last several presidencies. I think the volume of reporting is stunning, which is different. I mean, we're doing a lot of reporting, but I wouldn't put it all in the investigative basket. Where do I think this will all end? I would just say what I have reported, if you don't mind, which is I don't believe, based on what Mueller has indicated to Trump's attorneys, that he is going to charge the president with any crimes if he finds any evidence of them. Again, a big if he finds any evidence. I believe he's going to, again, based on what he's said to Trump's attorneys, that he's going to produce a report about acts that the president took that appear to involve efforts to obstruct the probe, and that the Congress will have the task of deciding what to do with that information. And The Post was an amazing movie, and even though everyone at The Post is steeped in the lore of that moment, I found it suspenseful and gripping and wonderful.
And I have to say, as a half-century Post person, still in my heart, the fact that the New York Times hated that movie was wonderful.
Who's going to play you in the movie? So, thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Dylan Samard. I'm a sophomore here at the Cronkite School, and my question is that in an environment internationally that's increasingly hostile to journalists, how does this upcoming generation of journalists sort of reverse that trend?
I'll start this one. Just by doing, my successor at the Washington Post, Marty Barron, puts it best, just do your work. And the more good work that's done, at least in this country, the better it will be for the future of journalists and journalism. Around the country, around the world, I think it's going to require more activism than there's been so far by journalists in this country and by journalists in other countries where they're still free, relatively free to do their work, to be more vocal and find more ways to keep people's attention on the fact that journalists are literally being killed for doing their work in many countries, that even countries in the European Union right now are beginning to limit the freedom of journalists in some of those countries in Eastern Europe. And this should be a scandal. This should be something that journalists in this country and Britain and other countries where journalists are free, like France, should be making a much bigger deal out of. There is something called the Committee to Protect Journalists, which does a really great job of keeping track of all this and being as active as it can be in doing something about it. But I think that more American journalists need to join in this. The fact that so many journalists are I refuse to go to Mexico. I won't go there on vacation. I've turned down speaking engagements there, not because I'm afraid for my own life, but because they kill journalists in Mexico. And the government allows it, and the government in some cases is behind it. I will not go to a country like that. And I think American journalists should take those kinds of stands.
Thank you so very much.
You're welcome. We got time for one last question for Carol, and that is, as you become increasingly well-known as a journalist and increasingly winning of prizes for your journalism, and your wisdom is courted by TV, you are on TV. And so what's it like, what rules do you have for yourself in becoming somebody who's interviewed on TV, on a panel on TV, as we so often see, especially in cable television?
I'm not sure I always do this perfectly or as well as probably Len would handle himself in these situations, but I try my darndest to avoid snark and opinion. I am often lured or courted into giving my opinion, and I try to focus on what we've reported in the paper. Sometimes some of the hosts don't give me enough time to say much more than the lead of our story. So, but you know, ultimately America is getting increasingly divided, as you all know, into two echo chambers. On one side, everybody wants to, in both of them, people are being told what they want to hear. They seek out that echo chamber. They seek out that news source, whether it's Fox or Rachel Maddow, Sean Hannity, or MSNBC. They seek out this entity that will tell them what they already believe. And I don't want to fall prey to that. I just want to give the facts. It is true that I'm on MSNBC a lot and not on Fox a lot. Perhaps that's because the facts that I'm providing are more appealing to one side than the other. But I just want to stick with what we've reported. And it is increasingly, I know by Len's question, what he's saying about when you get more famous, you get to be more of a celebrity and you start to like cultivate this brand. The brand I like, the Washington Post. The brand I like, good old-fashioned quality journalism. If I benefit from that, great, but it's all for the purpose of giving people revelatory information they wouldn't have if we weren't in the trenches.
Great place to stop. Carol's a wonderful role model for the students here. Carol, thank you so much.
Thank you.
For coming to do this.
Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out tonight and joining us. I'm Vanessa Ruiz, professor and director of the Borderlands Bureau at Cronkite News. I also work with Cronkite Noticias, our bilingual professional program. I'm also an anchor here at Arizona PBS, and I also feel a little bit like one of the unofficial ambassadors of all things diversity and inclusion here at Cronkite. So tonight we have a very special edition of our Must See Mondays panel series, The Limits of Objectivity, which will be led by our guest, Tanzina Vega. Now, Tanzina is a journalist, and she's a speaker on issues of race, media, and inequality in the United States. She's also an Eisner Fellow at the Nation Institute, author of the forthcoming book, Uppity, and also a Ferris Professor of Journalism at Princeton University. Tanzina has contributed to CNN, CNN Money, WNYC Radio, Reuters Television, Billboard Magazine, and the New York Times. That is where she won an Emmy Award for outstanding new approaches in documentary media and various other awards from the National Press Photographers Association. But most recently, Tanzina was named the new host of the nationally syndicated public radio program, The Takeaway. It is a prestigious position that will put her on the airwaves across the country starting May 7th, and it is truly an incredible opportunity for any journalist. NPR's Code Switch called her one of their journalists of color to watch, and the Huffington Post listed Tanzina as one of the 40 top Latinos in American media. We are incredibly fortunate to have her here tonight with us at Cronkite, so please join me in giving Tanzina a big round of welcome applause.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thanks, everyone, for coming tonight. I appreciate you being here. I'm a little bit jet lagged, so if I twist up my articles, my prepositions, you understand why. But in all seriousness, I think it's great that you all came out tonight, and I hope that I'll keep my remarks short because I would like to leave time for Q&A, because I think this is a topic that, to be honest, I don't have all the answers, but I will pose some questions, and I think there is some interesting conversation happening right now around this topic of objectivity and journalism. So I want to start with I want to open with a piece that I wrote for CNN almost exactly a year ago today. And the headline was, "Where is the empathy for Black poverty and pain?" And I'm quoting here. In the 1890s, the sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois noticed something disturbing about how Americans viewed the plight of Blacks in Philadelphia, who had suffered through unsanitary living conditions, high rates of consumption, and backbreaking labor. And Du Bois said, quote, "The most difficult social problem in the matter of Negro health is the peculiar attitude of the nation toward the well-being of the race." Du Bois continued, "There have, for instance, been few other cases in the history of civilized people where human suffering has been viewed with such peculiar indifference." And many can argue that that indifference towards the well-being of Blacks and, to a larger extent, people of color in the United States arguably continues today, particularly in how the media frames the struggles of those who are suffering from suicide and drug abuse at record rates, and yet rhetoric about Black Americans, Muslims, and Latinos has focused mostly on crime, inner cities, criminal aliens, and attacking radical Islamic terrorism as the scourge of our nation. Yet the economic anxiety facing Black and brown workers has largely been sidelined. So why do I bring this piece up? Because this empathy gap that I'm talking about still exists a year later. Because this type of thinking has consequences that affect policy, and the media plays a large role in how those narratives are created. And interestingly, I've been a news reporter pretty much all my life, but this was a story that I wrote as reported commentary. I hesitate to use the word opinion or op-ed. And that started to become a way where I could explore broader ideas without fighting to explain why and how these ideas were newsworthy or objective. In the piece, I also added that I had grown up in public housing in New York City, and I saw heroin and crack ravage my largely poor and Black and Latino community, and back then the drug epidemic was considered a crime to be eradicated rather than a public health issue that should be handled with compassion. But does growing up in public housing make me more of an objective voice to cover these issues or less? What about the fact that I'm Latina? What about the fact that I witnessed a lot of this abuse? You see, in many newsrooms, it's a difficult balance. Reporters of color are either expected to cover race and urban affairs, and trust me, I've been confused for being the Hispanic affairs reporter before, or backread and fact-check stories about race that other reporters have written. I've been asked to edit, gut-check, fact-check graphics and videos, and I would assume that all of that makes me some sort of an objective expert. But I've also talked to reporters of color who have told me stories of how difficult it is to pitch and write stories about race themselves, who constantly run into skeptical editors who are challenging their every thought. When I was a race reporter at the New York Times, a beat that I created for the paper, I was often asked in interviews whether I could be unbiased in my reporting on race since I am a woman of color. And every time I was asked this question, I pushed back. Well, what is it about me or other journalists of color that assumes we can't be objective? Objective according to who? You see, American newsrooms are 84% white and overwhelmingly male. And in a few decades, our country won't be. We sit here now today, 50 years after the Kerner Commission report warned of two Americas, quote, one white, one Black, separate and unequal. Newsrooms today must confront their roles in creating many of the racial narratives that we understand. And they must also confront their own institutional racism. These issues aren't new, though. This fall, when I was a visiting professor at Princeton University teaching a class on race in the media, I assigned News for All the People, the epic story of race and the American media by Juan Gonzalez and Joe Torres, which detailed the historical fight for racial and ethnic representation and parity in newsrooms around the country, from the colonial depictions of Black and Native Americans as barbarous and rebellious, to the suppression of stories by and about communities of color. We also read Volunteer Slavery, Jill Nelson's scathing memoir of her experience as the first Black woman to write for the Washington Post magazine. We analyzed the racial dynamics at play in the plagiarism scandals of Jason Blair, a Black New York Times reporter, and Stephen Glass, a white writer for the New Republic. We read Suki Kim's piece on the sexual harassment and bullying of women, particularly women of color, at WNYC. We followed the Jamel Hill story at ESPN, and we read the controversial New York Times profile of a Nazi sympathizer. All of our guest speakers were Black or Latino, and we went to places, literally and figuratively, that we hadn't gone before. Most importantly, we consume media that wasn't made for us or by us. And I assigned these exercises in part because one of the biggest mistakes the media punditry made about the 2016 election was underestimating the power of racist rhetoric. You see, there was a disconnect between what journalists of color were seeing and what white reporters were seeing, what white audiences were consuming, versus what Black and brown audiences were consuming. One example of that was during the campaign after the Access Hollywood tapes were released, and there was widespread condemnation from politicians on all sides of the aisle. The president's comments, or candidate Trump's comments at the time, were vulgar and triggering, yes, but so were his comments prior about the Central Park Five, about Mexicans, about Muslims, about veterans, and about the disabled. The day after the election, many journalists I knew were frightened. They were confused. They were concerned for their safety. I, too, have gotten hate mail sent to my home. Because I'm a journalist, they were worried about not being heard in their newsrooms. They were concerned about their role in the outcome of the election. And they, and we, should I say, were also exhausted. Even though I write about race, I often feel cast as the newsroom race whisperer. The burden that's put on so few journalists of color out there is this pressure that we have to speak for all people of color. And I think if we had more diversity in newsrooms, it would mean less pressure on just one of us to have to get it right. But slowly we've begun to see who the media has put forward to analyze this major political moment in the United States. And yet, the New York Times still does not have a permanent woman of color opinion columnist, and CNN's political coverage, while inclusive of some women of color, including my friends MJ Lee and Juana Summers, the majority of its analysis still skews male. MSNBC, Fox, and yes, even public radio have long allowed white journalists to be considered objective and neutral. Except we're no longer in neutral times. In an article for the Center for Media Ethics and Democracy, the writer Stephen Ward distinguishes between new objectivity and old objectivity. He describes old objectivity as traditional, dualistic. It draws a firm line between observation and interpretation of fact, neutral reporting and advocacy. It is exclusive. Reporters' opinions and interpretations are to be excluded from this type of good reporting. New objectivity, argues Ward, is different. It's pragmatic, it's pluralistic and holistic. It evaluates beliefs with a variety of standards. It is inclusive, it's open to the evaluation of many kinds of writing. It denies dualisms, A or B, and it views journalism as both factual and interpretive, and engaged chronicling. The key, says Ward, is that objective engagement does not require an all-encompassing neutrality which precludes expressing a view or coming to a conclusion, he says. He adds that both scientists and judges are impartial in method, but they rightly come to conclusions and take sides in conflicts. In other words, says Ward, objectivity is not a value-free zone. Journalists of color know this, and yet we're often asked to maintain objectivity in the face of cognitive dissonance, not wanting to alienate certain audiences by being too black, too brown, too partisan. But do we ask the same of our white colleagues? J.D. Vance, who wrote Hillbilly Elegy, has become a face of many of the issues affecting white, rural, poor Americans. But I don't think I've ever seen Vance ask whether or not he can objectively write about his experiences. In fact, it's precisely because Vance has lived these experiences that his point of view is valued, and more importantly, trusted. You see, objectivity and the skepticism that should go along with that is often defined by those in charge. And if those in charge have always been one group, then how does that reckon with the concept of objectivity? Is it not a function to assume that only certain people can be objective? And does that not have an impact on the news that we create? We don't only have an empathy gap, we also have a truth gap in this country, and it seems to be growing wider by the day. Journalists are caught in the middle of that storm, and many of them are losing their jobs, feeling the pressure of corporate demands, lackadaisical ownership, threats, trolls, and an almost daily dose of undermining from our administration. And I might add that trust in the media is at a very perilous low. There was a piece in the Christian Science Monitor recently that talked about one of the reasons for this lack of trust. And they say it's the erosion of the value of nonpartisan neutral reporting. Kevin Smith, the deputy director of the Kiplinger program at Ohio State University, and also a longtime leader at the Society of Professional Journalists, said, most people are willing to understand and listen to both sides, to the possibilities of compromise in both the liberal and the conservative management of government. He continues, so why would any organization want to alienate a huge segment of the population by suddenly deciding that we want to punt on neutral reporting and instead feed the beast on the left and the right? So what does that mean? Does that mean that there's more screaming on panels and less objective reporting? I mean, CBS's Les Moonves did say that the president was good for business after all. Do we lose the trust of an audience if we aren't neutral? And how do we remain objective when we have technology that allows us to film anything at a moment's notice? Technology that's given Americans a front row seat to the reality of what people of color experience every day, from racist tirades to police shootings to being arrested at a Starbucks for being black while waiting. Closing this empathy gap and redefining what's objective will not come easy. And part of the problem is that we live very segregated lives. 3/4 of white Americans don't have any non-white friends. I spoke to Charlton McElwain, a professor at New York University, for one of my stories, who told me that that's part of the problem. This empathy gap exists because people frequently lack any real connection to other people, and therefore they don't see them as one of us. Moving past that, said McElwain, is going to really require deep engagement with people at personal and community levels. But our community's continued segregation has to make that a challenge. Closing the truth gap, however, may prove to be even more difficult. This fall, when I guest hosted an episode of The Takeaway on WNYC, I interviewed a caller named Jonathan, who was white, in his 30s, for a story about white Americans who said they felt they were discriminated against The story's online. The half-an-hour interview is there. You can download it. Jonathan said he really hated the idea that, according to him, white people were considered racist. And he told me he had been pulled over many times by police. He had driven with a suspended license for years. And I asked him, had he ever feared for his life in any of those encounters? He told me he had not. He suggested that as long as people follow the rules with police, that they would be okay. And he disagreed with me when I told him that, had he been black, he may not have survived any of those police encounters. And even when I gave him a data point that clearly showed a racial discrepancy, he continued to disagree. So I'll leave you with this. Last summer, after Charlottesville, the Society of Professional Journalists issued guidance for journalists dealing with racial issues. Quote, "Objectivity is correctly cited as an elemental trait of good journalists," SPJ said, "which is exhibited in their ability to separate fact from fiction, regardless of their personal biases. Some people, unfortunately, confuse that trait with the concept of equivalence and suggest all points of view are inherently equal. Objectivity and equivalence are not the same." And then they state clearly and plainly, "The answer is that we objectively know that discrimination based on sex, race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, and other inherited traits is wrong, according to the Society for Professional Journalists." And they conclude by saying journalists should feel free to say so and forcefully challenge people who believe otherwise. Thank you. So on that note, I guess I'll take your questions, if there are any. No questions? Really? Light topic and... All right, I guess we figured it out.
Do you think that, how do I want to phrase this? Does anyone else have a question so I can think of this?
Yeah. Since you mentioned representation and opinion columnists, especially at the New York Times, could you address that again, taking into account the sort of ideological representation, for example, hiring Bret Stephens?
Sure.
Thanks.
Who I know, actually. I think that we have a significant amount of ideological representation, particularly the Times has been very careful to make sure that it has expanded its opinion pages to include a lot of that representation. They have Ross Douthat, they've got Bret, they've got a bunch of people now that represent that. In fact, they actually dedicated their I think it was their letters to the editor page a couple of weeks ago solely to Trump supporters. And they've done, you know, a significant amount of work in that space. And I think that they've been, as many news organizations have been trying to diversify their opinion, their opinion sections, right? And make sure that they have conservative views as well as liberal views. But I think the issue there is that there still isn't a representation for women of color, particularly for people with disabilities, for other people who don't fit into that sort of liberal or conservative, binary. And so I think a lot of organizations still have a long way to go, particularly in commentary and who's giving analysis. That demographic has to change. I hope that answered your question. On assigning the stories? I'm not sure I understand the question. When hiring people? I think you want your newsroom to reflect the community that you're covering, to be honest. At the very least, it should reflect the community that you're covering. And I think if it doesn't, you're doing a disservice to the people and the communities that you're covering. Now, obviously, there's local news, there's national news, there's regional stuff. So that all, that depends on what you're talking about. National news organizations have a responsibility, I think, to bring different voices to the table. But I think it's also, once again, it's pit in this sort of, we'll have conservative and we'll have a liberal and voice, and that's kind of it. Right, and we forget that there are other intersections that need to be explored. You're welcome. Hi.
Hi. My name is Raul Bencomo, student here at Cronkite. My question was, how do you think we can address the lack of interest of minority journalists, or do you think there is no lack of interest and it's just the accessibility?
That's a fantastic question. I think it's a lot about accessibility. I think it's a lot about understanding that that is a path open. I did not, I grew up low income, and I did not think that journalism was a path, right? I didn't have people who did this in my community or in my family, and so I kind of had to figure it out. And I think that that's starting to change a little bit because of social media, because we now have the production means in our hands, right? I can make a whole movie on this thing, right? And export it and put it up. And so the barriers to communicating have shifted. But I still, the numbers are still the same. And I agree, it does have to come from, people wanting to get into the business as well. One of the biggest barriers for not just people of color, but low-income people and middle-income people to getting into journalism is cost, right? It's the cost. Can you afford to live in New York City and take an unpaid internship? Probably not, right? That's not something that a lot of people can afford to do. So I think, and that affects anybody who's low income, regardless of race. So I think that those are the barriers to access that journalism has that has to get better.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I guess my question is, when looking at the grand scheme of things, and then also individuals who make up that grand scheme, is it better for beat reporters to be objective? Like if I have a sports reporter going to go do a story, can he be objective if he's already, a sports fan, and that's likely why he got into the field? And what does that reflect?
So if I'm a Mets fan,
let's
I'm
say.
in Arizona, so I don't know what that equivalent would be here, but they're winning in New York, so this is a big deal. So if I'm a Mets fan, can I cover a Yankees game?
Well, can a professional in a particular field who already has a large understanding of that, can they be objective or are they already biased? And what does that mean for your audience?
So let's talk about it. And using the sports analogies, right? How many sports commentators, like A-Rod is now a commentator, right? Is he biased or is he just really the right person to be in the job? Because he's played the game, he's won the, you see what I'm saying? I think in journalism we also see, particularly as you go higher and higher up in bigger and bigger organizations, you'll see people who maybe once were doctors, who were lawyers, who maybe got into the field. And so, you know, if you're a former doctor and then you become a healthcare reporter, I would think that your knowledge of healthcare is pretty amazing. I don't know how, you know, if you're going to be a good journalist, but I know that you'll be, you know, your expertise is there, right? So I think that the idea that you can have that, I mean, we all have that. The idea that journalists are, you know, completely have no opinions about everything is untrue. And I think it undermines a little bit of our trust with the audience. But I'm totally capable of, I think a lot of us are very capable of doing that.
Would that mean that as a result that perhaps it's better to abandon objectivity in favor of transparency, or?
So that's one of the arguments actually around this conversation of objectivity versus neutrality versus equivalency versus transparency. There are lots of arguments for more transparency to say that that would actually increase. Now, I think that there are limits to that. I think that transparency in the process is really important. I think there is a lack of media literacy, and so a lot of people don't really understand how journalism works, how it comes together, what our role is in democracy, what our role is as far as, you know, doing what we do. A lot of people just don't understand, you know, how this comes together. So I think transparency is important, to have people really know, well, where did you get that and how did you find that? And we see a lot of that online. We see a lot of linking and a lot of, you know, source material being put out there. But, you know, there's Jay Rosen, who's a professor at NYU and talks a lot about this issue, does say he disagrees with this concept of neutrality. And he says, you know, he thinks, according to him, he thinks that it'd be better if people just said, look, this is where I'm coming from, but I'm still capable of doing my job, right? So here's where I'm coming from, and I'm going to report the news now.
Okay. And then just lastly, I know I'm taking up like 3 questions. Well, is it dangerous to go to that extent? Because the whole reason I came to this school was I was on television once and I was misquoted by ABC, and going back away from that experience, I thought to myself, like, if I ever gave someone a platform to speak on, their word is their word. So that's the gray area that I found myself in, and I just wanted your opinion. Is it dangerous to stray away from objectivity?
I don't think you're straying. I think what we're talking about is, where does objectivity, whose objectivity, right? And I think the election was a very specific example of a certain worldview leading the conversation that wasn't entirely accurate, right? We didn't hear journalists actually calling a lot of this rhetoric racist, like using the word racist, until I think it was after Charlottesville or after like whatever the latest tragedy, was. And so I think that's not necessarily danger. That's if we're calling that under this veil of objectivity, that's a false equivalency. That's not objectivity, right? And so I think we have to be really careful about that. I agree that we don't want to go too far, but would you rather know the truth about what you're hearing, or, I think there's an argument. And again, I don't have the answers. And I think we're all kind of experimenting now to figure out what's the best way to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I will say this, though, you don't want to deal in falsities, right? And so that's what, we're all assuming that we're dealing in fact. So, okay.
Hi, so I'm white, I'm upper middle class, and I'm a journalist. So what do I do to help other minority journalists get ahead? Because a lot of people would say that I've had a lot of advantages handed to me just because I'm white, upper middle class, and female. So what do I do to help even the playing field and make sure that everybody has a chance?
That's a really great question. I tend to think that there's nothing wrong with being competitive. Journalism is a competitive field, and you know what? You've got to get the story first, you've got to do your job, and you've got to do what you have to do. So first of all, focus on work, right? And doing your job really well. I always say the best revenge is good work, so make sure you do that first. I think it's important to look at one of the biggest issues that we run into in terms of diversifying newsrooms is that it's something that either happens at the very low levels of the pipeline, right? Or and we see like the percentages getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller as we get all the way to the top. And I think what that indicates is that there's a problem in the middle, is in the pipeline, right? You need to have, no matter where you work, you got to have allies. You got to have somebody in the office that you can be like, hey, this is a rough day, a rough story. Let's take a walk around the block, whatever. I think oftentimes we stay in our silos, right? We stay very segregated because that's often the way we live, right? And maybe work is one of the only places where you're actually interacting with people who don't look like you or who don't come from the same, place that you do. So I think first just start with the basics, create genuine relationships, not forced relationships, not something that, no one wants to feel like, hi, I'm the diversity person here, and I'm the reason why, no one wants to feel that they're the diversity hire. I actually wrote a piece about this for CNN called, top 10 reasons your newsroom can change, to stop being so white. So there are lots of things in there, but that's mostly from a managerial perspective. Your question is interesting because it's from a colleague perspective, I'm assuming. So I think it's really just creating authentic relationships and not necessarily saying, oh, I'm not going to take this, but, making room for other people at the table, working in diverse groups, and if you see someone who's doing good work, that's one of the things that I love to do. If I see someone's doing good work, I want to talk them up to everybody because I want to work with that person more, right? Be generous in your praise and be a good worker and just try to bring people into the fold, right? So that those people also have opportunities to rise. I think really that we don't think about what being a good colleague is. And to me, and it's not if they the person doesn't deserve it, obviously, like you're doing this, but if you're working with someone who's just fantastic, be generous with praise, talk them up to other people, you know what I mean? Work in tandem with people and create amazing work. Because as much as let's say you're the reporter and you're working with a great producer, both of you will rise, from that experience. So.
Awesome, thank you.
You're welcome.
So I am white and upper middle class as well, which has given me many advantages, but I'm also Jewish and part of the LGBT community, which means that some of my inherent opinions about politics and about the world seemed incompatible with the values of objectivity that are taught at the school in some ways. What advice do you have for minority people of all kinds to navigate the limits of objectivity and finding that balance between being true to our own worldview while also being objective?
Mm-hmm. That's a really tough question. It's kind of what I'm trying to figure out in this. I said I didn't have all the answers. I agree. I think that what you're describing is, I guess academically is termed as intersectionality, right? And the different identities that all of us bring to the table. And I think that, for so long, we haven't really had to think about that. We haven't brought our whole selves to work, right? And suddenly now we're sort of bringing all these identities to the table. And there's a lot of stuff going on, right? And so I think at the end of the day, you're still a journalist, right? You still abide by the rules of, factual, gathering of facts and reporting what you see and not trying to interpret things beyond where they should, be interpreted. I think at the same time, use your experiences to inform your reporting, right? Often I see a hole, for example. I grew up, working class and in public housing. I spent 20 years of my life there. And I'm like, why are people not writing about poverty? Why are we not writing about class, right? Does that make me an expert in it, or does that make me not subjective? Like, what is that, or objective? Like, I don't know. I just know it's a great story, and it's one that I intimately feel, and it's one that I intimately understand. But I don't just leave it at a personal narrative about growing up, how I grew up. It's more, okay, well, let me use this as a jumping off point to say, explore public housing policy in the United States, to look at what HUD is doing, to think about, okay, my experience with seeing public housing that looks like this, how is it changing today, right? To sort of bring that wealth of information that you have to the table, as well. And see that as an asset, to bringing it. But you could still, you're still a journalist. So that doesn't mean you only have to cover LGBTQ issues, or you only have to cover, that's the thing I try. Don't get pigeonholed where you don't want to be pigeonholed. But remember, you come with a wealth of information that can easily be accessed for stories, and your own expertise should be used for that, I don't know if that helps you, kind of, but...
Did. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi. Hi, my name's Alexis. I'm a freshman here. And I just wanted to know, because you mentioned how but being able to intern places that don't pay and still being a working class person, how do you balance that, or how did you balance that?
So it was very hard. I didn't go into journalism right away, meaning right after college, because it was something that I I had to get a job, right? And I had been working since I was 14, and so, to me, that was the most important thing. I didn't have the luxury to take an unpaid internship, so I didn't take an unpaid internship. I just couldn't. I ended up making the decision to go to graduate school later in my career, I'd say mid-career, and it was an economic decision, largely. It was, this is the school that's going to give me the best bang for my buck. It's not going to put me in the hole. Like, these are things that, a lot of journalists don't like to talk about money, but you have to talk about money. You have to understand the business of journalism. You have to understand what it costs to get into the field. You have to understand, the different, and these are all real concerns. The other thing I did was I did not work for free at all. Even if that meant like publishing, I remember I got a little article